everyone. Welcome to this episode of the Antelope Hill Book Club podcast. We are your usual hosts. My name is Taylor Young.
And I'm Kurt Seidel.
And we have a special guest with us today. We have Dave Reilly from the Backlash. I don't know what I was going to say. I've really no idea why I stumbled over that one. But Dave, say hello. Introduce yourself.
Hello. Yes, thank you so much for having me. My name is David J. Reilly. I'm the co-host on the Backlash podcast. We are a American nationalist, right-wing dissident, alt-right, whatever you want to call us, podcast. We have shows on Mondays and Wednesdays, and you can find us at thebacklash.net.
Cool. Awesome. Out of all of those words, I think that dissident right is the one that I really just can't nail down the meaning of. It seems like it's gone through at least like 3 or 4 180-degree revolutions in terms of how people use it. Yeah, no, sounds good.
Yeah, it's all word salad anymore. Anyway, most of these things are defined by the left anyway, so it's very difficult to pin down really what we are at this point.
Yeah, that's very true. So the book we're talking about today is our recent book, Rise of the Reich, which was originally published by the SS main office in Germany in 1941, shortly before the U.S. entered the war. So I guess maybe Dave first, and then Kurt, if you guys have any opening thoughts about this book, then go ahead.
Actually, if you want to go to Kurt first, my heater turned on. So if you want to give it a minute, and then the heater will turn off, and I'll be a little bit better sounding.
Sure, Kurt, you're on the spot.
All right, I'll save us from the technical difficulties here. So this book, as Taylor said, was published by the SS Hauptamt main office, and it's a book that takes you through sort of a survey of German history from the particular ideological perspective of the SS. Now, as I've said before about this book, the SS's ideological tendencies are not necessarily those of the German state, of the National Socialist movement, or of any other particular subset of the National Socialist movement. They have a very particular development ideologically. Some of it is simply slightly different or emphasizes slightly different aspects of German history and of National Socialist ideology. Some of it occasionally is even in open conflict with the avowed ideological positions of other parts of the movement. So that is, in my view, what makes this an interesting work. Now, to me, of course, much of the historical context is sort of old hat. With all of the works that we've put out through Antelope Hill. German history is obviously something that we do quite a lot of. But I found it very interesting, certain of the things that the SS chooses to focus on that are somewhat unusual for a German ideological work from this period. I suppose we'll get more into detail on that as we go through it, but that's sort of my opening thoughts.
Yeah, it was super interesting, reading through this because there were definitely like the very first thing that I had in my mind when I was reading this book was like, okay, so I know that the SS main office put this out, but like, who actually wrote the book? Like, what was their name? Who were they? What was their background? And what was their like personal religious convictions behind it? Because it is, kind of interesting, right? Like I'm pretty well known to be like a traditional Catholic in our circles and everything like that. So, reading the book as you go through, there's definitely stuff that sticks out to me as like, oh, well, that's interesting, or not understanding exactly how it would fit in to the wider thing. It is a very particular lens that they look through, and it is. It's so funny, right? Because like when I, not gonna lie, like when I first bought the book, I thought that this was going to be like the history of the National Socialist movement. I thought that this was going to be kind of chronicling everything from like the German Civil War up to Hitler's rise of power through the lens of the SS. And that is definitely not what this book is. This book was more akin to the to the Vladimir Putin Tucker Carlson interview where like Tucker asks Vladimir about Ukraine and he goes on like an hour and a half tangent about Russian history all the way back to like, the 800s. Because
here it's the author says, okay, well, first we have to start with the European glacial maximum.
Yeah. It goes all the way back to like, Proto-Indo-Europeans and, the different tribes throughout Europe in their pre-Christian era, basically. And I think a lot of it has to do with, seeking to justify the territorial gains that Germany had under Hitler, right? Like this is like the Sudetenland, the Rhineland, the Eastern expansion and Austria, right? Like they were trying to, through a kind of anthropological way, be like, okay, we're going to lay out the case that all of these lands were German. Here's all these different artifacts and historical evidence that these were the German people's lands as a kind of justification for the actions that had been taken, which is interesting. I did not think that that's where they were going to go with this. And of course, it's always one of the interesting things about this book is that, throughout there's all kinds of diagrams and exhibits, pictures of bronze tools, let's say, or garb, instruments, spears, stuff like that, as well as maps that are constantly kind of painting the picture of where the Germanic peoples lived and showing the lands that they inhabited, and then throughout the ages showing where they had retreated to, areas that were German speaking but not actually a part of the German state and stuff like that. And so I definitely think that there was like an element of that in this. But yeah, one of the other big things that kind of smacked me upside the head was also just the absolute anti-Catholic nature of whoever wrote this book. They did not like the Catholic Church at all. And so this telling of German history is very hostile to the church, frequently describing it as foreign influence. And I found that interesting, very interesting.
So there's a number of things that we can go off of there. And perhaps, Dave, you have divined that it is, I actually thought that your religious perspective might make kind of a look at the history told in this particular way particularly interesting to talk about. So I'm glad we brought that up. But so we have that. We have also interested in was what Kurt was saying earlier about how this is a uniquely SS perspective. And Dave, you'd also asked, like, do we know anything about the specific author of this book? I personally don't. I don't know if we really do. But maybe we can kind of start on. Maybe there's some unity between these trains of thought. So maybe we could start with Kurt, if you want to tell us a little bit more about what you mean by this being a specifically SS perspective, and also in terms of, like you said, some of what you felt were the more unique historical tidbits that they focused on, and how it might contrast with other ideological perspectives in National Socialist Germany.
Okay, well, that's a lot to take off in one bite, but I'll start sort of from the beginning there. So the SS, most people are at least have a vague understanding of their sort of ideological purpose within the National Socialist movement, and also of their sort of broad positions. Of course, the SS is very stridently pan-German. That is, they are in favor of the inclusion of all German peoples within one German state, which would include at various times, of course, Austria, Switzerland, and in the broader application, also Scandinavia or parts of Scandinavia, the Netherlands, northern Belgium, or Flanders, and additionally, the large German diaspora that previously existed in Eastern and Central Europe outside of the German borders. So, of course, the SS is also under the command of Heinrich Himmler. Many people are sort of familiar with Himmler's fascination with European and Germanic prehistory. He and the SS, as well as a few other elements of the German government, sponsored a lot of archaeological and anthropological studies. Very famously, the expedition to Tibet by the Onondaga, which was affiliated with and under the SS. So, of course, that plays into just how far back they're going, the whole way back to the Indo-Aryan migrations, the European or the Ice Age period in Europe, and all of these other sorts of niche anthropological and archaeological studies. So that reflects a particular fascination of the SS with prehistory. When you're looking at, like Dave mentioned, all of the bronze implements and the clothing and all of that sort of thing, that already is something much different from the standard German justifications for basically their positions and also the war. If you asked a member of the army, of course, they would justify it primarily through military necessity. They wouldn't be studying the migrations of the Goths and the Vandals in the Vistula Basin in 3000 BC.
Gotcha. So I think it's pretty well known that there were occasionally sources of tension between some of the different like ideological strains in National Socialist Germany. So is there anything is there anything like internally controversial to National Socialism in the book's perspective?
Well, the largest thing, of course, is, I think, as already noted, the very stridently anti-Catholic tone. There is also, related to that, a pretty extreme elevation and almost worship of Prussia as sort of the superior German state. The Austrians are not shown in a very good light in this book, and also sort of just anyone who's not a Prussian is sort of relegated to a decidedly secondary position in German history. Prussia are the good guys. The church reformers and a lot of the radicals in the 30 Years' War are the good guys. The Catholics are the bad guys. The church are the bad guys. The Habsburgs are the bad guys.
Right.
Right. So, maybe we can toss it back to you, Dave, or maybe we can it's funny. It's like, it's a short book, and like a lot of the sections are just very short. Sometimes they're just like a sentence or two, but that it covers so much ground that it makes it pretty difficult to kind of know where to sink your teeth into. But but maybe we should take a little bit of a step back and just give a little bit of an outline. So the book, broadly speaking, it starts with the prehistoric period. It starts with the glaciers, the migration of the Nordic peoples, through the conflicts with Rome, the fall of Rome after that, further German migrations after that, which, as the author notes, kind of have mixed successes. A lot of these Germanic kingdoms of that time die out, or their like Germanic upper class just ends up becoming assimilated. And then you have the three German Reichs. So you have the Holy Roman Empire, which that history of that probably takes up about half of the book of the First Reich. So the Holy Roman Empire and its various evolutions. You have which is finally put to an end by Napoleon. Then you have the Second Reich, which is Prussia. And I forget off the top of my head or
to be specific, the Prussian-dominated German Empire, founded in 1871.
Yeah, and I forget what the end point identified for that is. And then obviously you have Hitler's Third Reich. Right. Yes.
1918 is the abdication of Kaiser Wilhelm at the end of the First World War.
Right. So the obviously with the Middle Ages, the period of the fall of Rome, you have the arrival of Christianity in Germany, and I think it's noted that a lot of Germany converts fairly quickly. It's kind of funny, it is among like the general anti-Catholic sentiment. There's also like a sentence just praising the Germans as being pious people. So of course they would, be good Christians because they're just generally pious people. But the problem, as I kind of understood it from the author's argument, is that there's a unique kind of tension between the German Reich and the Catholic Church, stemming from the kind of political religious development of the Papal States and the Holy Roman Empire. So do either of you want to speak about that at all, and what your thoughts were on that? Maybe Dave, we can start with you, and then Kurt.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so, it's interesting, right? I mean, like the conflict with Rome starts with the conflict of like the Goths, right? And during like the time of the Holy Roman Empire. And then, it talks about, let's see here. This was from page 40. It talks about, Rome has been shattered by the overwhelming force of the Germanic peoples during the migration period. However, as these waves of Germanic tribes penetrated the Roman territories, they also began to racially mix with the native populations, leading to the adoption of Christianity. For the Germanic tribes that migrated southward, their resistance to this foreign teaching waned because through intermixing with southern races, they lost their impressive Nordic qualities. And then it says in Germania itself, Christianization was systematically carried out by the Pope, starting around 200 monks and bishops under his directive work to blend Germanic concepts of God with Christian ideas, cleverly and deliberately embedding this foreign ideology into the Germanic peoples. And then it goes on to talk about how most of the Germans kind of sided with the Arian heresy, and then eventually that was overcome, and they actually converted to the Catholic faith. But starting out like right there on page 40, I mean, even really before page 40, I mean, like the story that they tell, right, of like the pre-Roman, ancient Indo, whatever groups of people, right? It still doesn't really explain where people came from. And like, this is like directly in conflict with Christianity and the story of like Adam and Eve, the story of Noah and the flood, with Europe being the sons of Japheth. So it doesn't really explain where people came from. It's just like, oh, well, they're here and they worship Thor and Odin, and we have all these ancient pagan practices. And then Rome started shoving Christianity down our throats. And, we wouldn't have succumbed to this if it weren't for race mixing. And I mean, I kind of disagree with that whole thing on its face. But it's an interesting take. Then he goes on to talk about, this is page 63. They go on to talk about like the Crusades, and how the Crusades were a show of force from a political papacy which sought to establish itself as the supreme leader of the West. For the German people, these campaigns led to another weakening of their Nordic blood, resulting in the loss of many of their best men for a senseless war. And it's like, okay, well, was it senseless, or were the Crusades based? The West was under attack from Islam. Spain had been taken over by the Moors. And, the papacy was fighting for Europe to be free of Islam. And so it's just kind of interesting to me that the author kind of took umbrage even with the Crusades. I'm not sure if that's really answering the question that you asked. If you could like refresh my memory about that.
I mean, I think that's it's a good kind of overview. I do agree that I think the criticism of the Crusades is maybe a little I don't know, unfortunate. That's their view, obviously. But no, go ahead.
Well, and I mean, it leads me to question, exactly, like, is this actually the opinion of the SS, or is this the opinion of an author in the SS that, because the SS seems to be a little bit more of a diverse organization, in that, like, we have figures from history like Leon de Grelle, right? He was the president or the chancellor of Belgium. At one point, he was the youngest elected European leader in European history. He founded the Reichs party and, was fighting against communism. And eventually, the Jews, the communists, were able to kind of overrun Belgium, and they exiled him. And he, went to Germany, where he became an SS volunteer. And it is interesting to note that Leon de Grelle's troop or brigade or whatever it was one of the only ones in the SS to be given a chaplain. They had their own bishop that kind of looked after their spiritual needs and, would do mass for them and give them spiritual guidance, etc. But, Leon de Grelle, he was a Catholic his whole life. He was a National Socialist through and through. It's just interesting that among an organization that otherwise didn't have any Catholic chaplains, they made this cutout for Leon de Grelle. And I think that one of the things that this book kind of shows that's interesting is that Germany itself was a very I hate to use the word, but diverse. It was, I mean, at the time of Hitler's rise to power, about a quarter of Germany was Catholic and 75% of it was Lutheran. And among the Lutheran or Protestant elements, there was, say, lack of unity, but that it itself was diverse. There was, many different Protestant groups that all kind of had differing opinions one from another. And so this telling of German history is very particular in that it is clearly very colored by the author himself, who also, it's not just that he was also anti-Catholic, there was also elements of it that are, kind of skeptical of just Christianity in general. He eventually winds up going into, you see if I went through and I made little folds in the pages for, these things that kind of jumped out at me. He starts talking about, Luther and Lutheranism, I think on page 89. Dang it. I wish it was page 88, but it's page 89. And so they talk so close. And they're talking about Luther's struggle against the church, which taking his anti-Catholic priors in the book, he definitely seems to be very much in favor of Luther's struggle against the church, in that he paints it as the German people kind of finally like rising up and throwing off the foreign influence of the Catholic Church and doing its own thing as a racial group, as a cultural, as a people group, or whatever you want to call it. And that's it's certainly interesting. And then he also, I think, on page 94, this was something that I thought was super interesting. I don't mean to like dominate the whole thing or turn this into like a religious podcast or anything, but it is, I think, worth talking about. Let's see, this is from page 95. The Counter-Reformation and the Jesuit Order. As the Reformation was sweeping triumphantly across Germany at that time, 7/8 of the population in what is now Catholic Austria were Protestant. The Jesuit Order was founded in Spain. Its missions was not only to halt the decline of the papacy and thus the Catholic Church, but to revitalize it and reclaim large parts of its lost territory. Unfortunately, the Germans, specifically the Habsburgs, played a regrettable role in this re-Catholicization. As a result, a sharply divided state with different religious affiliations emerged within the empire, permanently solidifying the split of the German people. By 1600, the religious boundaries were largely set in place, shaping the landscape of the fatherland to this day. Even today, Luther is often blamed for causing a religious schism within Germany. However, if there was a schism or religious war, it was not Luther's fault, but rather the powers like the Jesuit order and the princes who followed them that stopped the Reformation from reaching its natural conclusion, in which the last remaining Catholic minority would have converted to Protestantism. So you can see, like, very clearly there, like, it would depend on who you talk to, right? Like, if you talk to a Catholic, Martin Luther was a horny monk that, broke away from the Catholic Church because he couldn't keep it in his pants, and he started his own religious group. But if you talk to a Lutheran, they would very adamantly say, oh no, like it was about reform and the indulgences that were being sold and the corrupt hierarchy and episcopacy, like that was really bad and that needed to get taken care of. But you see what I'm saying with the lens through which this author sees history. He clearly says, like I said on page 95, that he believes it was the Catholic Church that was responsible for the schism between Protestant and Catholic, as opposed to Luther. And so it's a very interesting way of looking at that history. It's one I think that most Catholics would completely disagree with, but it is unique. And it's interesting that type of point of view was there in the Reich at the time, if that makes some sense.
Yeah. So, well, let me say something, Kurt, and then maybe that'll give you something to jump off of with. I follow the argument. I want to maybe push back a little bit. It seems like both of you have agreed that overall it is quite an anti-Catholic work. And there's the parts we read about how it was actually all the Catholic Church's fault, and we're going to side with Luther. I mean, I'm a Protestant, so I'm partial to Luther, but that's not really the point. I would like to offer maybe another, like the way that I primarily saw the whole scope of what he was saying is that, and maybe this is being generous, but again, I'm putting a different view out there. Is that there was kind of a unique historical confluence of, misjudgments, coincidences, maybe you could say tragedies in specifically the formation of the Holy Roman Empire, its role in the formation of the Papal States, and then kind of the relationship between the two. And so, for example, the author also notes at one point that pretty early on, comparatively speaking, there's other European states like France that are able to develop a stronger centralized state, and therefore by default, the Pope is able to exercise less influence over them. And so he doesn't even really bother to have the fight. Whereas with Germany, Germany remains a very ironically dependent on the Papal States for, a religious authority, for its own political authority. And just suffers from a very weak, basically sometimes non-existent central state. And all these things together kind of result in a conflict between the two where, from the author's perspective at least, Germany suffers under the ability of the Papal States to impose its material interests on this, large state, this large population that lacks a central authority. And so, you can definitely see how the anti-Catholic sentiment arises from that. But I think what I'm trying to say is that there's an argument that, which is kind of how I see it, just from my perspective, from what I think is like politically practical. Like for me, the takeaway isn't really that the Catholic Church is necessarily like a subversive influence in and of itself. It's more of like a cautionary tale about the relationship between religion and state. So go ahead.
I can see that too. I can absolutely see that too. And yeah, it is, I mean, the history of Germany is kind of tragic in that, like, there are these kind of rise and falls of these different states and different governing types. And it's, and with all of this, like, just saying that like a book itself might be like a little anti-Catholic or, a particular author or whatever. I mean, again, remember that 25% of Germany at the time, and Hitler himself, were Catholic. And so there's also a way of looking at the rise of the Reich and the history of it that would lead one to being positive of National Socialism from a Catholic lens. But that's just not what this book is arguing, right? This book is arguing for a different segment of the population that would have been more pro-Lutheran. Also, later in the book, he talks about, I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to find this particular quote, but, they were talking about, I flipped right to it, page 121, talking about the revolution of 1848, which, that was a pretty liberal revolution. It was bad for the old order of things, if you will. There was 30 or 40 different kingdoms that were overthrown that summer during the protests of 1848. And it's interesting that, he's very positive on that. He says, the efforts of the German bourgeoisie in 1848, culminating in the Frankfurt National Assembly, were unable to establish a German Reich despite their good intentions. And it's just interesting that, again, from the point of view of the Catholic Church, that would not have been a good thing at all. That whole movement was thoroughly condemned by Pope Pius IX. But it's interesting, right? Because the German population would have been made up of a large, again, diverse swatch of people from all different backgrounds and viewpoints. And this book certainly is making an argument for that particular viewpoint. It's just it'd be interesting to know what percentage of the population would have fallen into that category, because even like I said with Leon deGrael, not even all of the SS would have been of that. So it's interesting, because looking back at history, I think we want to have things be black and white and very us versus them, or this group versus that group. But in reality, it seems very nuanced, that there were a lot of different competing factions and traditions and schools of thought that would have ultimately settled on National Socialism. And I think that's fascinating. I think that's one of the reasons why people should read the book, because we're certainly not given that perspective in public school. In public school, it's just Hitler bad, Nazis bad. They were all totalitarian. They're all guilty of the murder of 6 million, blah, blah, blah. Whereas I think that even, just from reading this book, which you can read in like a day, you can see very clearly that there was a lot more going on.
So a couple things I wanted to kind of revisit briefly here. One of the things when it comes to the church's influence on Germany, I just wanted to mention because we sort of skipped over it.
Mm-hmm.
Prior to all the controversies that would lead to the Reformation and the 30 Years' War, sort of between Charlemagne and Charles V, there had been a lot of prior controversies that involved the Catholic Church in the internal political affairs of Germany. The largest one, of course, was the investiture controversy, where the papacy began to assert the sole authority to appoint or approve the appointment of bishops within Germany. This was all involved in a sort of larger political conflict in Italy between two factions that we know as the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. Basically, the papacy had begun to align a sort of loose league or confederation of Italian cities, essentially resisting the rule of the emperor. And instead following the Pope's lead as a political confederation. So this did go much further back than just sort of the era of the 30 Years' War. There was a sort of repeated hostility between Rome and the emperors. Also included things like papal support for rebellious dukes within Germany. There was, again, all sort of bound up in this political back and forth. That really did. I think the historical argument is pretty incontrovertibly clear that the papacy's involvement in German politics was a very bad thing from the perspective of German political unity. And it certainly did have that effect. The other thing I wanted to touch on, so I think there's sort of an open question here of how much does this author's or committee or whoever, in fact, put the words to the page in this case, how closely the authorial perspective of this book aligns with that of the SS in general. And I do have to say, I think the evidence is pretty strong that this does align with the SS's general perspective on religious matters. Of course, you've noted that de Grel's unit, the Wallonian, they had to be granted sort of a special exemption in order to have chaplains in their unit. I would like to note that this book touches a lot on these sort of rebellious figures during the period of the 30 Years' War. Florian Geyer, Georg von Frundsberg, a couple others that basically also appear elsewhere in SS sort of lore. The names of several Waffen SS divisions are named after these kinds of characters that were anti-Catholic or anti-Rome, maybe more precisely during this time period before the Protestant-Catholic divide had really solidified. And the expansion of the SS to include a lot of these non-German foreign volunteers, including de Grel's Belgians, wouldn't happen later until like mid-1943. So that they sort of relaxed the rules, but I do think that it is an accurate reflection of their original ideological convictions. The pragmatic considerations of wartime might have sort of relaxed them, but they were genuinely held convictions, I believe.
Interesting. Yeah.
Okay. I do think that we should move on to a couple other topics. But Dave, do you want to have any last word on that, or
No. I thought it was fascinating.
So I think the foreword in this book is actually the translator's introduction is very useful. It pointed out a number of repeated themes that you see in the text that I want to kind of shift the conversation to now. And in particular, there were three that I think are very easy to see in how the narrative is told. There is the let me find a portion to read. So the emphasis, this is on page 13 in the Roman numerals, so it's in the introduction. The emphasis on the principles of Blut und Boden further strengthens this narrative. By portraying German land as an integral part of the Volk's identity, the Volks, I believe that's how you pronounce the V, but Kurt can correct me. The text ties the nation's spiritual and racial essence to its geographic and agricultural roots, while the Reich is the manifestation of the folk spirit, sustained and justified by its national mission. So, in other words, and you see this even in the prehistorical narrative, and I think one of the places that I kind of mentioned earlier that was the most interesting, to me, where I saw it is where it talks about some of the migrations that took place after or during the fall of the Roman Empire, where you have a lot of German tribes that moved around throughout to Europe, to the Black Sea, to North Africa, to Spain, to other places. And there's this heavy emphasis put on the fact that these people had become disconnected from their ancestral land, and they failed to successfully put down roots on the new land. And they became, in most cases, just a ruling class over the people who existed there. And then eventually they just became assimilated. They lost what the author sees as their uniquely German character, and therefore essentially ceased historically to be identified as German peoples. You know, you can sometimes people talk about the Visigoth role in Spain, but no one really thinks of Spain, as a Germanic descended state. So that's one. So you have the relationship between blood and soil. The other is the focus on individual leaders who kind of were very key to the destiny to the German national destiny. People like Charlemagne, Henry the Fowler, all the Fredericks of Prussia, Bismarck, and then of course Hitler. So you have the Führer principle, I think it's called. And then the third one that I wanted to mention was, again, the focus on the role of the state, and specifically of how for so long Germany lacked a central state, and this was really the cause. This is meant that the praiseworthy and noble German people were kind of just perpetual victims of the whims of stronger powers around them, because they had no means by which to express their own sovereignty or their own destiny. So I wanted to put that out there and hand it back over to you guys. If you have any general thoughts, or if there's any one of those in particular that interests you.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there's a quote here on page 158 that kind of plugs right into that. The heading is "Germans are the foundation of the Reich," saying, "Today we are convinced that the current German Reich in its fundamental structure is the result of a long historical development ordained by Providence. Its racial basis, leadership principles, and ideological underpinnings align with our nature and are therefore correct. The foundation of our Reich is the German people. Man is bound by divine law to his national community, for better or for worse. Our state is built on this understanding, not as an end in itself, but as a means to preserve, protect, and foster the growth of our people, from whom all foreign elements must be removed so as to maintain our integrity. And so that's there too. And it's interesting too that, throughout this struggle that the book goes over, the centuries of struggle. I don't have the quote on me. I was looking for it. I couldn't find it. But basically talking about how in National Socialist Germany, they had finally perfected democracy as an expression of the will of the German people being finally represented by the state. And it was because they were finally all together on their ancestral homeland with leaders that actually cared about them, that weren't just bureaucrats or foreign influence, and that they had kind of landed on an era of self-actualization, like a civilizational state. And I, to a large extent, I do think that's true, which is interesting. I don't know if Kurt has anything to add.
Not on that precisely, but I did want to touch back on the point about the sort of blood and soil focus of the historical narrative here. And I think that's where I'll revisit for a moment, like the considerations about the migration period with German tribes going out into the broader sort of post-Roman Mediterranean world. And I think it's also largely true of the author's disfavor towards the Crusades. So I think the issue isn't in those cases that, like, for example, the Crusades were unjustified, which is the sort of leftist response to that, right? We've all heard the sob stories about the poor innocent Muslims who didn't do anything wrong, and the mean crusaders just show up and decide to start killing a bunch of them one day. But the problem, I think, in their view, is that the Crusades took these sort of fraternal orders of knights, and whereas it may have been better if they had, for example, been put to work recolonizing Spain, aiding their cousins down there, instead they were sort of just thrown into the genetic shredder of the Levant, and a few generations later, all of that sort of human potential had been squandered more or less for nothing. So that's sort of where I see the opposition to the Crusades coming in. It's part of that broader idea that for a people to be strong and for its efforts to yield anything in the long term, they need to be, they cannot be torn away from the national community like that. It fits in also with the whole idea of Lebensraum and the sort of necessity of acquiring land to support the German people in Germany. Of course, a lot of National Socialist works from this time period are very concerned about the number of Germans that have gone to America. And while they might remain Germans in some sense, genetically or with certain cultural inheritances, they are sort of forever. Germany itself is being permanently deprived of those people and severed from them. They're cut off from the national community, and that to them is a great tragedy.
Yeah, so that's I'm glad you brought that up, because that's another thing that I was thinking about a lot while reading it, is thinking of the relevance of these ideas and this kind of the philosophical underpinnings of nationalism in its National Socialist form in the American context, and how this applies or doesn't apply to both American history and especially modern nationalism in America. And so I guess to kind of put a fine point on it, the author has a great advantage in being able to trace the history of his people, all the way back to when Northern Europe was frozen over, and whatever you may think of it, being able to draw this pretty cohesive, pretty intuitive narrative of the Germans as a people that settled in a specific part of Northern Europe and have pretty much been there for several thousand years. And everything else about, certainly in this presentation of National Socialism kind of flows very easily from that. Whereas in America, there's certainly, a argument for white nationalism in the lowercase sense of America being a historically white nation, and therefore when we talk about America, when we use the word, we are referring to that historically white nation, and it's kind of just like implies that we're just temporarily passing through a period where this is not the case, or this is not perfectly reflected in the state or the demographics. But ultimately, we, the American nation, refer to the white Americans. And so American nationalism is a uniquely white phenomenon. And it's this kind of step 1, 2, and 3, and then in the future this results in whatever version of America you want. But I'm not trying to say that I necessarily disagree with that, or that it's impossible or anything, but I think it's very clearly a lot messier than that. And so I guess the question is, is the same kind of thinking about our collective history, is it possible in the American context for us? Is it desirable? And what does it imply about, I guess, modern, contemporary, today American nationalism? So I know this is very broad. Maybe it's unhelpfully broad, but do you have any thoughts just going off of that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's much more difficult with America than it is with like Germany or France or England or something like that, because of the mix of people, right? I mean, like my podcast co-host, Rebecca, she traces her family lineage all the way to the Mayflower. Whereas I'm only a third generation American, believe it or not. My grandfather was the first one on the Irish side that was, born in this country. On my mother's side, I think I'm only a second generation American. They came from Italy. And so I have a uniquely different story, I guess, for like why I'm here in America and what I'm doing here than, let's say, Rebecca would. And so with that, I think that there's just a lot of different stories and histories that kind of go into the American people. And I'm not sure if we're ever going to find like some sort of like unified history of it, right? Because to those who came over on the Mayflower, right, us, I don't know if I can say it, but I'll say it. Maybe you can blur it out later or bleep it out later. But, us dirty spaghetti niggers or potato niggers that came over here, in these subsequent waves of migration, we kind of constituted a disruption of their ethnic dominance in this country and their inheritance, if you will. But then we would all find agreement in the post 1965 Hart-Celler Immigration Act, and we would both look at the waves of immigrants that have come over here since then and be like, yeah, these people do not belong here. They're not American. We need to get them out. And so, I mean, to a certain degree, I think that there's an element of being able to come together on that and have like a kind of unified story about the subversion of America and its decline through immigration. But at the same time, there's still going to be, and that's to say nothing of the people that grew up in the South, that, you know, their grandparents fought in the Civil War or something like that, right? They're going to have a completely different story than a Yankee or, you know, someone like me who's, you know, relatively more fresh off the boat, if that makes some level of sense. I mean, America's been kind of an aspirational state since its foundation. And I mean, I think that there is like an element where that will be able to come together. But it's a uniquely different situation than what we had in Germany, or even in Italy, or in Ireland, or England. You know, it's going to be different, and so the solutions for that, and how we find our way out of this mess, and how the American people, whatever that may be, it goes through this process of ethnogenesis, of becoming who they are, of finding out who they are, and then exerting that politically when it comes to the state. It's going to look a lot different than it did in Germany, that's for sure. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, well, it did. It's, you know, kind of what I was looking for. But I guess the way I think about it is that, to me, the lesson is that this is the only way to do it. And we have to, you know, the idea of American ethnogenesis, the idea of identifying, you know, white Americans as a specific group that we are part of, and that we focus our efforts on, that we owe our true loyalty to, that we want to be reflected in the state. It seems to me like an attempt to create a blood and soil destiny. Because I think there is something to the idea that these things have to exist together. There's only that, or on the other hand, you know, you're necessarily going to have a multicultural, at least if not multiracial, empire, which is always going to have a much harder time defining its identity, or at least is going to have a much harder time being with its identity being a home for any specific group of people. So I think the way I think about it is that we have to at least acknowledge that. We have to acknowledge that there is a unique difficulty to the progress of American history, because, like you mentioned, even if, you know, your starting point is very simply that this is a white nation that has been long subverted by immigration, and that, you know, non-whites are just obviously not part of this. You know, it's not a hard argument to make. But then, what do you do with the different, you know, the history of white immigration that also, you know, undeniably did change American culture and changed a lot of stuff about American society? You know, is it necessarily going to have to lead to deconstructing that further? And that is something that people talk about. You know, sometimes when people say, well, ultimately, we're just an Anglo-Saxon nation, which personally, I think that ship has just sailed. I think that I probably ultimately agree with kind of what you're bringing up as the practical endpoint here, which is that there has to be an ethnogenesis of all white Americans. But I think that... So another thing, not to throw too much, you know, all in one dialogue here, but another thing that I appreciated about the book is that the author is very willing to criticize the Germans, and he's willing to criticize German history. He's willing to criticize German leaders who failed. You know, there's kind of no way of looking at this consistent failure, for example, of a centralized state, and not there being some kind of criticism of the Germans in there, and of their disunity. And so I think to have some level of humility toward yourself is necessary for a nationalist. And I think that that is possibly even more necessary in the American context, because it is so difficult to actually, disentangle all these different threads of our histories. Like, we're only going to be able to achieve this if we are willing to be humble about ourselves and our own history. I'll leave it at that. Kurt, you haven't spoken in a while, so do you have anything to say?
Well, geez, I haven't been able to get a word in.
Sorry.
So, yeah, I mean, I've had a couple of ideas over the course of this conversation, but I'm sure I've forgotten most of them by this point. But I do want to sort of offer a contrasting view here. I mean, you say that we have unique difficulties as Americans, and certainly we have unique difficulties, but we are not unique in having unique difficulties.
Right.
Of course, we've just been over all the unique difficulties that Germany faced with the fairly extreme religious divide, which as Americans we don't so much have to deal with, thanks to sort of developing a national identity during a very secular age. Despite maybe the best efforts of some people on the right to undo that, we really don't have a large religious divide as a nation on the whole. We don't really have a history of political disunity. Of course, you mentioned, the Civil War and between Northerners and Southerners. But compared to what the Germans were dealing with, they, of course, had their own sort of North-South divide. They had the Protestant-Catholic divide. They had divisions into all of these little states. They had no real history of centralized rule. They had no real history of having a national state. After all, someone back then might have been asking, what do an Austrian and a Prussian have in common besides the language? There were all sorts of obstacles standing in the way of realizing a true national unity that went beyond just the superficial. But they managed it, and I think that Americans can manage it. I think that the ethnic divisions, of course, you two have been talking about the history of white immigration, but from cultural backgrounds that don't necessarily mesh with the sort of heritage American identity. But I don't really think that gap is certainly not impossible to bridge. But I don't even think it's particularly difficult in the grand scheme of all the nationalist movements that have ever been successful. Certainly, Irish and Italians have the difficulty of having been a sort of concentrated urban population, which led to some more prolonged cultural divisions compared to, let's say, the German settlers in the Midwest, who were more rural, who assimilated more readily. But of course, they too spoke and wrote in German in many places until about 100 years ago. Long story short, I'll stop myself from rambling too much. I really don't think that it is as dire of a situation as some people might think. Difficult, yes, absolutely. But comparatively, perhaps not so much.
And for as much as the situation in America today is different than it was in Germany, over 100 years ago, there's a lot of similarities too. One of these passages that kind of leapt off the page at me on page 128, talking about the dangers of industrialization. Let me read a little passage from here. It says, rapid industrialization, however, brought with it a dangerous shift in the balance of the nation's strength. Urban centers swelled with people while rural areas were left desolate. Peasants not only earned less, but were often displaced from their land by foreign large-scale landholders, aided by Jewish moneylenders and merchants. This undermined the very roots of the German people, Although the nation still stood strong like a tree in the full bloom of spring, the German people focused too much on the advancements of technology and industry, forgetting that the inexhaustible wellspring of life lay in their agrarian roots. And like, when I read that, I'm just like, geez, this guy could be talking about America right now. You know, I mean, we're seeing it between BlackRock and Blackstone and all of these giant hedge funds that are buying up all the single family properties. And, you know, we've gone through this age of deindustrialization where it's almost like the exact opposite in a way, but in a similar way where, like, you know, the cities that were these powerhouses of industry are essentially ghost towns in their own way now. And even in the rural areas too, though, you know, like when you travel through certain areas of like Kansas or Oklahoma, you come through these towns, population 200-300, and like all the people are like 65 plus. There's like no kids. And so like a lot of those same struggles that Germany had at the time, we've got today in our own unique way. And certainly when it comes to, and this book didn't really get into it, I wish it had, but the Bolshevization of their culture that took place from 1919, the German Civil War on to the 1920s. You know, we've got a lot in common with that too. The transgenderism, the LGBT stuff, the opiate crisis, a lot of those same struggles were going on in Germany. And, you know, it's producing the same reaction in America that it produced in Germany at the same time. So for as different as the situation is in America, both ethnically, religiously, culturally, it's still very similar, if that makes some sense.
Yeah, certainly. It's when you first started, you know, you said you're going to talk about the similarities. My first thought, well, yeah, similarity is we're both ruled by Jews for one, and then that's exactly what you said. So, yeah, yeah, no, that's very true. Yeah, I guess I don't have much more myself to say on that. I certainly agree that I think that there's a lot of similarities to be drawn. I think what I appreciate is kind of like I was saying earlier. I felt that there were a lot of principles to be drawn as well. Like you know, you need to have a knowledge of your history to be an effective nationalist. Again, I think we've talked about how that's relevant in the American context. You know, you have, again, very, very clearly in this book, the necessity of, you know, not just identifying the kind of identity of the nation, the blood, the folk, but it has to be reflected in a sovereign state. You know, obviously that is the conflict that we have is, you know, we don't have the situation of, you know, the Holy Roman Empire, for example. We have a very strong state, but it is, like we just said, a state that is not fundamentally beholden to our people. And so we are kind of in the same position of we are fighting for control of the state. We are fighting for the coming into existence of a sovereign white American state. You know, and more besides that. But like I said, I think that pretty much covers most of the kind of thoughts that I had generally. So is there anything else that either of you had on your mind that you wanted to cover from the book that we haven't talked about yet?
Not really. I mean, I think we covered it. I mean, I thought it was a really unique view. And I think it's again, it's super helpful to be able to read a historical work like this that shows these kind of differences of opinion, differences of the lens through which the history is seen and told. Because, you know, being an American, you know, growing up, having gone to, I went to public and private school, but it's like, you know, you're given the History Channel version of history, and specifically of the NSDAP, of Germany. And that view is just so not based in reality at all. And I just think it's really helpful to be able to go back and to read something like this, an official work that was produced by an official arm in Germany, to gain some sort of historical perspective. I mean, there's a quote here, another one. I made a lot of little bookmarks before we went live. Let's see, here it is. Yeah, so this is like from like the very, very end of the book, talking about the Reich and the world. And I think this is interesting. It says, the Reich's position in relation to the rest of the world is based on the natural right of a nation to claim its fair share on earth, a share warranted by its size, strength, and achievements. This ensures that every individual within the nation is guaranteed a dignified existence. The cooperation of all peoples of Germanic heritage is, furthermore, our natural goal. Equality among all nations on earth within this framework of peaceful cooperation for the benefit of our people and mankind in general forms the foundation of our foreign policy. Wow. That is not what I was told was going on in Germany, let alone the official position of the SS or something like that. We're told that it was about world domination, that we'd all be speaking German if Hitler had won. And I just find it interesting to be able to go back and look at something like this where they are self-defining. They are, giving
in their own words, if you will,
their point of view in their own words. I find it fascinating because that is not what I was told. That's not what 99% of people are told. And when you read something like that in the context of this nation struggling for its own existence over centuries, and it's like, we just want to be like left alone. We just like want to be able to prosper in peace without being like subjugated by, other nations, by foreign powers, foreign interests. It's incredible to read.
Yeah. Well, Kurt, do you have anything else that you want to talk about? Or if not, give us your final thoughts, I suppose.
No, I don't want to drag it out too long. I feel like I've already gone on long enough about this. But I think, Dave, that's a really good summary of sort of the significance of this book. It's, I think, also a very good intro to the parts of German history that basically nobody who is not already sort of a student of German history knows about, the medieval history, all of that, and how it's relevant to the modern political developments that were taking place around this time. That I think is sort of a unique advantage of this sort of work. Histories that focus on the National Socialist movement written by British or American authors, even to the extent that they are fair or even favorable, don't really tend to grasp the importance of those thousands of years of history on the sort of self-conception of the authors of a work like this. So I think that's sort of the best thing that I got out of this work.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Okay, all right. Well, before we go, Dave, do you want to tell people where to find you guys and your stuff and any of your personal links, anything you want to shout out?
Yeah, sure. I mean, you can go to davidjreilly.com. That's got links to all of my stuff and my podcast, thebacklash.net. we're on Mondays and Wednesdays, and we try to deal with all of these types of things. One of my podcast co-hosts, is Protestant. The other one is a kind of fallen away Catholic, whereas I'm kind of the crazy, crazy traditional Catholic, monomaniacal about it. And we try to deal with all of these different aspects of America becoming, America awakening, white people trying to figure out our place in this society and how it is that we're supposed to move forward, living in an empire that basically hates us and subjugates us and, has done nothing but ill towards us since at least 1965. This is all kind of the stuff that we talk about, and we're extremely thankful to Antelope Hill's sponsorship of our work, and your books are incredible. I'm about to, now that I'm done with this book, I'm about to start reading the Nuremberg, The Last Battle by David Irving. I'm really excited to dig into that. So thank you for all that you guys do.
Nice. Awesome. Yeah, no, we're very happy to sponsor you guys and cooperate and collaborate wherever we can. So, I guess that's it. So to the audience, thank you as always for listening. You can pick up the book on our website, antelopehillpublishing.com. Consider supporting us on Substack as well. You'll get an extra podcast episode each month, so look out for the second one this month. And that's it. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you on the next one.